This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 220 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Something you're going to hear me talk about over the next few months is my prospect model. One of my favorite ways to find rookie gems at running back and wide receiver for fantasy purposes is through analyzing numbers. I know that's shocking to hear. To give you some background, the model isn't complex. It looks at successful fantasy football running backs in the NFL, and it finds the things that those players typically did well in college. So it weighs in things like the percentage of attempts seen in the player's backfield or attempt share. It looks at the percentage of receptions caught in the player's offense and passing game or reception share. It'll take just a handful of those inputs, factor in strength of schedule given the college that the player is coming from, a few measurables, age, the draft equity spent to obtain the player, and boom, you've got an overall score for a prospect. But I don't use those scores to make all the decisions for me. I use them to see if there are any market inefficiencies for particular players. For instance, I didn't need my model to tell me that Saquon Barkley was the consensus first overall pick last year in rookie drafts. There was a chance that Barkley wouldn't pop the way that the consensus believed, but he did. Saquon Barkley was the best running back that my model had ever seen since 2005, which is where it dates back to. The reason looking at college production can work, though, is because fantasy-relevant running backs and wide receivers at the NFL level don't usually come from nowhere, or at least sustainable fantasy assets don't. If you're a graphic designer, chances are you didn't become a good graphic designer overnight when you were 30 years old. You more than likely learned the skill either when you were young or you went to school and you got good at design. The same goes for almost any profession, and that's no different in football. If a running back or a wide receiver is talented and productive at the NFL level, chances are they were productive in college. If this sounds like a really basic concept, it's because it is. But there are plenty of people who ignore production when evaluating prospects, and that doesn't make sense to me when it can be added value in your process. Now, I don't think production tells us everything. There's a reason I weigh where players get drafted in my overall model. It's because not only will those players get first crack at playing time, but baked into draft equity is team evaluation. And those teams are going to be better than I am at grinding film. But production can spot red flags and concerns with players. If we know successful NFL running backs almost always see a high attempt share, then it would be concerning for an incoming back to have a low attempt share mark. It doesn't mean that he's going to bust, it just means that he's a bigger risk. I posted an article on Monday over on NumberFire.com called Which Draft Hopeful Running Backs Produced Like Studs in College? And it's one that I've done over the last couple of seasons on the site. My plan today is to talk through that a bit and provide some more context to how I'm feeling about particular running backs in this year's class. And hopefully you don't walk away from today's show saying to yourself, I just wasted 15 minutes of my life. I could have watched half an episode of Impractical Jokers during that time. Which, by the way, Impractical Jokers is an elite show. But back to the study. The goal of the article that I did on NumberFire was to look at successful NFL running backs, see how they fared from a production standpoint during their final collegiate season, and then compare that production to this year's class. The thing is, though, success is subjective. The way you define a successful running back is probably different than the way that I do. To me, subjectivity is fine with something like this. We're not trying to get definitive answers. We're trying to find basic trends and see if there are any concerns with guys in this year's running back draft class. We're living in the gray area. Since I worry most about fantasy football with all of this prospecting work, I define success as a running back in the NFL who's averaged 13 or more PPR points per game for more than one season since 2011. Yeah, I told you this is all pretty subjective. But averaging that many points per game usually puts a back in the top 20. And doing that for multiple years means that they're giving you sustained production, not just some random one-off season with that type of output. That gave me 26 FBS running backs who played at least 6 games during their final season. That's our NFL studs sample. Those are the running backs to compare this year's class to. And speaking of this year's class, for purposes of not getting too carried away, I only looked, or will be looking today, at the 27 running backs who were invited to the NFL Combine. So we've got 26 running backs who have been successful fantasy assets at the NFL level, and 27 who haven't done a thing yet as professionals except get invited to the Combine. And just so you know, if some of these players didn't play much at all during their final collegiate season, whether it's due to injury or something else, I used their last relevant college campaign. Now, I wouldn't be doing this podcast today if the college sample had better production than our stud NFL sample. Among the 26 running backs who have been successful in fantasy for us, the average attempt share that those backs saw in their final collegiate seasons was 47.5%. So the average running back in that sample saw about 48% of his team's attempts during his final college season. With the guys who were invited to the Combine this year, that number was 38.1%. And that type of difference in production was seen everywhere. Attempts per game had a 4 carry difference, rushing yards per game had a 30-yard difference, rushing yard share saw a 12% difference, reception share saw a 4% difference, and touchdown share saw about a 10% difference. Again, it's not so crazy to know that successful NFL running backs were also good in college, but that's why we're doing this today. As I alluded to earlier, looking at production can spot red flags with some players. Ronald Jones, for example, had a really low reception share during his final collegiate season, and that really translated to the NFL. One of the key reasons that Ronald Jones wasn't able to get on the field more during his rookie season was his receiving ability. But if you look at some of the first and second round busts over the last decade or so, a lot of those players had production-related red flags. Christine Michael is actually listed as the worst top 2 round pick in my model since 2005. And it's kind of hilarious just given his story with the fantasy industry. But when you dig in, it makes sense. During his final collegiate season, he saw just 8 attempts per game, he had an attempt share of just 16.5%, and he caught fewer than 3% of Texas A&M's passes. Some of you may not even remember Ryan Williams, but he was the second worst. At Virginia Tech, he didn't even hit a 20% attempt share during his final year, despite playing 10 games. This isn't to say that my prospect model is flawless. In fact, given what I just talked about, it's not going to be as good at spotting running backs who shared a backfield with another professional running back. And actually, let's start there. Let's start with that idea. Because in this year's draft class, we got 2 prime examples where teammates have usage concerns when compared to the NFL stud sample. The first is with Josh Jacobs and Damian Harris out of Alabama, and the other is with Tony Pollard and Darrell Henderson from Memphis. None of those players were able to get a 37% attempt share this past season. And remember, 47.5% was the average attempt share among our stud NFL sample. And I should note that in that stud sample, we've got Adrian Peterson and Todd Gurley. They played 7 and 6 games during their final collegiate seasons. That's going to bring down the group's attempt share. And actually, only 6 of the other 24 running backs in our stud sample had final season attempt shares that were lower than the college sample averages. And only 2 of them played more than 11 games, those 2 being Devontae Freeman and Eddie Lacy. Let me start by talking about the Memphis running backs and Darrell Henderson and Tony Pollard. Henderson still had a 35% attempt share last year, so it wasn't crazy low. Pollard's, though, was just 13%. But Pollard doesn't profile as an early down back. He's a hybrid player. He can play wide receiver. He was actually listed as a wide receiver throughout college. Maybe you take that as a knock on Henderson because he was losing touches to a non-traditional running back. But Henderson makes up for his lack of usage with extreme efficiency. He averaged almost 9 yards per carry over his sophomore and junior seasons. So even with a lower attempt share, he's one of my favorite running backs in this class. But it should be noted that there's some concern. It's not that big though, in my opinion. The bigger issue is with Josh Jacobs and Damian Harris. To many, Jacobs is this year's top running back prospect. And by the eye test, it's easy to understand why. He's versatile and he fits today's NFL really well. If you're a believer in Jacobs or Jacobs in the first round, then you're basically hoping he's a Kamara-like prospect. One thing that's interesting though is that Alvin Kamara had better per game marks than Jacobs during his final season at Tennessee. And we all know that Alvin Kamara is a decent-sized outlier at the position from a college production standpoint. The better production comp is probably Sony Michel, especially since Michel split a backfield with a good prospect in Nick Chubb. And that's what we're seeing with Damian Harris. But even Michel's production profile looks better than Jacobs. The other point to make here is that Kamara and Michel both landed in really good situations. I'm not saying they're bad running backs. Please hear this carefully. Sony Michel and Alvin Kamara are good running backs. I just mean their impact may end up being a little bit overstated given the offenses that they're in, that's all. And I don't think these low attempt shares means that Jacobs and Harris will both bust. It's true that we rarely see 2 running back teammates from the same draft class pan out. Chubb and Michel are actually outliers when looking at the last decade worth of drafts. But I do think it will go a long way in how I and we should view Jacobs if Harris is also a high selection. Because as I said earlier, draft equity matters. Where a player gets drafted tells us about his potential immediate opportunity, but also that an NFL team viewed that player as a good one. Adding draft equity into my model allows for an easy way to capture evaluation and potential opportunity. So if a team sees Harris as really good, that means Jacobs was sharing a backfield with a really good player. So his lower rushing share marks make more sense. This is an exercise about probability. A lower rushing share and lower production marks doesn't automatically mean a player will be bad. It just means they're higher variance prospects, and that's how I view Josh Jacobs. I won't talk that much more about the Alabama backs on today's show. My prospect model isn't in love with them for all the reasons that I just talked about, but that doesn't mean that I'm not. Like I said, I think they're higher variance picks, but draft equity will go a long way for those players, especially Jacobs. So that's all attempt share. The Alabama runners are the main ones with attempt share concerns. With rushing yard share, or the percentage of team rushing yards seen from a running back, we get a pretty similar story. That's not that surprising though, considering a higher share of attempts will lead to a higher share of yards. The NFL stud sample, or the players who have been good in fantasy for us since 2011, the average rushing yards per game that they saw in college was 120. That's during their final season. Only 2 running backs in this year's class matched that mark. Those were Travion Williams and Darrell Henderson. I told you that Darrell Henderson was insanely efficient. And only Travion Williams, David Montgomery, Alexander Mattison, and Alex Barnes matched the NFL sample's final season rushing yard share. So basically, we're looking at a running back draft class that wasn't fantastic from a production standpoint. And that sort of aligns with the thinking of draft scouts that this running back class isn't that special. One player who stuck out to me throughout this production analysis was James Williams, or Boobie Williams. Williams had some rushing yard related concerns. He averaged 43.3 yards per game last year, but that accounted for nearly 55% of Washington State's rushing yards. That Washington State team under Mike Leach was predictably pass heavy. That explains why Williams' yards per game mark was so low, but his rushing yard share was strong, and that's why I'm not as concerned about his low per game numbers. And Williams has by far the best receiving profile of any back in this class. Again, he was in a pass-heavy offense, but his 83 catches accounted for over 17% of Washington State's receptions. That was the best mark in this year's class. And while some of you might say that it was just the system, and that's partially true, Williams' reception share was also over 5 percentage points higher or better than any other running back in that system since Leach took over in 2012. So count me in as someone who thinks that Williams is a really intriguing prospect for today's pass-friendly NFL. I tweeted this out last week, but a very easy comp is James White. Now, speaking of receiving, I think my model weighs receiving production a little bit heavier than others do. And a big reason for that is because even if a successful NFL running back isn't a primary pass catcher as a pro, they were still seeing the ball a lot in college through the air. It's almost like teams want to get the ball to their best players whenever they can. This was a place where Alvin Kamara was actually really, really good as a prospect. And it's something that I wish I would have focused on more when evaluating him 2 years ago. Now, I mention this all the time, but I only liked Kamara when he was drafted by the Saints. I didn't care for him much entering the draft. Fortunately, he landed in a spot where I saw the situation as amazingly good, or else I would have looked like an idiot, or more of an idiot than I already do. But Kamara had a final season reception share of nearly 17%, which was one of the top marks among the NFL sample. Only one non-injured player in the NFL stud group saw fewer than 10 receiving yards per game, and the lowest reception share among the backs was 5.5%. We've got plenty of running backs in this year's class who didn't hit those marks last season. Benny Snell ended up seeing a good enough reception share, but he averaged just 8.1 receiving yards per game. But this is an instance that's sort of like the opposite of Boobie Williams. While Williams had low rushing yard numbers because he was in a pass-first offense, Snell had low receiving numbers because Kentucky was one of the most run-heavy teams in college football last year. His reception share was actually almost 9%, which is totally fine. So I don't think that Benny Snell's receiving profile is that much of a red flag. Devin Singletary's kind of is, though. I've seen some scouts put Singletary as their top back in this year's class. He was a beast at Florida Atlantic, scoring 54 freaking times over the last 2 years. But as a receiver last season, he caught only 6 passes. He had one of the worst final season reception shares in this class. Now, I do think that's a red flag. I think that matters. But fortunately, during his freshman season, he had a 12% reception share, and then that dipped to 8.1% during his sophomore season. I don't think it's good to see those numbers progressively drop, but at least we have some sample of him doing something as a receiver. Singletary doesn't have any touchdown scoring concerns, but Mike Weber does. He's one of the top running backs in this year's class according to DraftScout.com, but he had just 8% of Ohio State's touchdowns last year. And to go along with that, he only handled 30% of Ohio State's attempts, and he had fewer than 40% of the team's rushing yards. So altogether, strictly from a production profile standpoint, Weber's got some concerns. But really, he's the only relevant running back that stood out in the touchdown share category. So thus far, I've run through players who have concerns with usage, rushing production, receiving production, and touchdown production. I think the obvious question now is, which players fit the mold? Which players produced like NFL studs during their final year of college? Well, when you filter out this year's draft class by using the market share averages of the NFL stud sample, only one name emerges. And that name isn't Travion Williams or David Montgomery. It's Alex Barnes. Some of you probably haven't even heard of Alex Barnes. And honestly, I hadn't really dug in until the name appeared through the filtering. But last season, Barnes had an attempt share above 50%, his rushing yard share was almost 62%, his reception share was 12%, and his touchdown share almost 39%. It was a really complete profile. Now, I want to read what I wrote in the article that I'm referencing because it should help wrap your head around what this result means. I wrote, "This doesn't tell us that Alex Barnes is a slam dunk running back prospect. Successful NFL running backs were good in college, but that doesn't mean that successful college running backs will then be good in the NFL. We should really be more concerned about players with concerns." This Barnes result, to me, is more of a watch this guy situation than anything else. So no, Alex Barnes isn't my RB1. That would be stupid. But I'm certainly watching to see what Barnes will do at the combine and where he might get drafted if he does get drafted, because his production profile during his final season was pretty dope. Now, when you loosen those filters a bit, two new names emerge: Travion Williams and David Montgomery. It's crazy how few running backs have good final season numbers in this year's draft class, but like I said, I do think it plays into the notion that this is not a great class. Not that that matters, given the position is pretty replaceable in the NFL. Sorry, I had to throw that in there. It does matter, though, from the standpoint of draft equity. More than usual, it feels like a season where landing spot is going to matter a whole lot for some of these guys. You don't have a Christian McCaffrey or Saquon Barkley or Ezekiel Elliott type player who's going to automatically demand a lot of work in their offense right away. Or at least right now you don't. There's no consensus top running back. There's no consensus workhorse back. Now, it's cool from the standpoint that we get to let our evaluations do the talking right now, but being tied to some of these players doesn't make a whole lot of sense from a fantasy standpoint. I can tell you that I do have David Montgomery as my RB1 right now. And I'm a big fan of Benny Snell, Travion Williams, and Darrell Henderson. And my sort of lower on the radar guy is Boobie Williams, who I think has the right skill set for today's game. That doesn't mean that I've got anything against Josh Jacobs and Damian Harris, though. I'm very open to making one of them the top back in this year's class if the landing spot is right. Because like I said, I think that's the approach that we've got to take this year. At least right now, before the combines even happened. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you guys for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. And if you could, I'd really appreciate a rating and review over on iTunes. It goes a really long way to helping this show out. And I'm also on Twitter at LateRoundQB. If you have a question for this week's mailbag show, you can hit me up on there or email me at jj@numberfire.com. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you later in the week.